Okay, so this is Roger Yates speaking to you. This is a podcast version of a lecture that I gave on the 15th of January 2014, part of the VIP Vegan Information Project mini course on social movements with case studies about animal advocacy. So this one really is about collective behavior, theories about social movements going back to the 1920s right up to the 1960s and a little bit beyond that to some degree, and it's going to take us up to something called resource mobilization. Now the reason that I've done the podcast is that we didn't film it on the night because we knew that we wouldn't get through much of it, so this will be the complete thing which I was going to deliver, so those who attended can listen to this and then see the bits that are missing, as it were. I also referenced a reading list on the night, and so I'll fill the gaps in with that. On this particular film, I'll take a shot of each slide and then place it on the film at the appropriate time, so you'll be able to follow it along by just watching the film. And so that means that you wouldn't have to look at the separate PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so we start with the issue of collective behavior, and there's a correction from the oh yeah, I should also say two things. One is that this is a follow-on from the opening statement about social movement theory, which is on YouTube. You'll be able to find that on the Vegan Information Project channel, or just put Vegan Information Project in the YouTube search. Also the VIP website. So it's a follow-on for that. The second one is that there's 4 cats at the moment running around this house, so if there's a bit of disruption on the audio, then it will be down to them. I've got Tidge right by my feet right now, in fact. Hello, Tidge. So there might be a little bit of disruption, but we'll carry on. Now, in the opening statement about social movements, I did talk about collective action, which was a mistake. I should have been talking about collective behaviour, so that's just a slight correction on that. Okay, so we start off with a theorist called Elton Mayo, talking in the 1920s and 30s, and he says that any aspiration for a radically different order were seen as the irrational fantasies of discontented individuals and outbursts of irrational sentiment. So we really are starting again at these very negative views of social movements. He reports that Bolshevism, fascism, socialism were dreams and reveries created by the monotony of industrial labour. So this is kind of industrial sociology. The solution lay in counselling and social support to help the so-called afflicted. Now, theoretically, Mayo assumes that his present society was basically okay, and so this is a functionalist view of society. The needs of society, speaking generally, are met by prevailing relations. So in this model, society has built-in mechanisms to bring it back into a sense of equilibrium. So discontent, when it existed in society, was understood on an individual level and also as a form of social pathology. So this represents a response to social movements as such, as a refusal to engage with them on their own terms. In other words, the pathological assumption was imposed from the outside. Now, I always tell my students in sociology in general that social movement theorists and theorists in general are products of their time. And so this guy is writing in the 1930s, 1940s, and the legacy of the 1930s were a response to extreme circumstances. In other words, the legacy of the 1930s, with the rise of Hitler, etc., was hostile towards the idea of mass movements, or the issue of mass. And you can see some of that actually by looking at Century of the Self on YouTube. Freeman and Johnson, and their book, just looking it up here, is called Waves of Protest, Social Movements Since the 1960s. That the title itself is quite good, from 1999. It talks about the issue of waves of protest, and they characterize pre-war movements as extremist in nature, and because of that view of them, that shaped the analysis of them. So, as I said then, in sociology, the main body of Western social theory in the 1940s, 1950s endorsed the structural functional, or the structural functionist type of analysis, which suggested essentially that under normal circumstances, society handles its problems and tasks through a framework of institutions which represent a stable social order. In this system, channels of communication are organized and formalized. The system, therefore, can, by and large, resolve its own problems. The system has mechanisms and devices for problem solving, mainly political parties and the government. And of course, we still get that issue of if you have a grievance, write to your MP or write to your TD in the Irish context. But there are other mechanisms too, for example, parties, trade unions, interest groups, associations, lobbies, and pressure groups. Now, there is a slight overlap to be mentioned there, in the sense that lobbies, but particular pressure groups, might sound like social movements, but there is a difference which we'll come to in a couple of minutes. The system in general is seen as legitimate and functional, and so essentially then we're dealing with a theory which says there's no space for social movements. Seymour Lipset, who talked about the two-party system, talked about that as the democratic expression of the class struggle. In the 1950s then, the view was that the party system could pretty much handle societal problems. Beyond these formal mechanisms, there was a series of special interest arenas. That's where you get all the pressure groups, etc. All in all then, the system functions pretty well. There is definitely no need for social movements, and indeed there is no social space for them. Essentially, social movements do not fit this model very easily, and they don't fit with the rest of the component parts, because social movements are seen as not very orderly and not very regulated, whereas everything else was. If they seem to fit anywhere, it's in the little leftover bits. The leftover bits of a society, in other words, the bits of society which are not fully sorted out yet, or not fully organized yet. Not surprisingly then, because society mainly had things well ordered, social movements could only realistically seem to exist on the margins of society. A famous sociologist called Emil Durkheim talked about social effervescence, or social fizzing, and it's a kind of thing about there's some kind of disturbance, or what I've called turbulence in society, and this might congeal into social movement activity, or a mass movement kind of activity. But essentially we're talking about individuals joining together. It's just a particular way of looking at social movements. Now, the theory of collective behaviour represents the first explicit attempt to make sense of large-scale social movements. Its popular counterpart might be said to be the notion of rent-a-mob. In other words, the idea that there is a pool of potential members or supporters available to be drawn on into all and any form of activity. And this relates to a story that I often tell about the 1980s when I was active in Liverpool, when we used to be on our animal advocacy stall, and people that I refer to as "you should be caring about people" would appear at the stall and effectively say, "you should be caring about people and not animals." And my response used to be, well, I'm interested in both, so what are you doing? Do you have a petition? Do you have any leaflets about human issues? And they would say, no, I don't. And essentially what was going on there was that there are some people who think there's a social category called demonstrator or protester, and these people will just be available, as it were, for this activity wherever it takes place. And in fact, I was quite surprised, if not shocked, by the other day there was a reference to this on BBC Radio 5 Live, where there was a journalist talking about the fracking movement, and there was a audio of a demonstration, some chanting, etc. When it went back to the studio, the journalist said, well, these people just seem as though they're there because they're having a good time, and if they weren't there, then maybe they'd be somewhere else, which is a real kind of throwback to this kind of idea. In fact, the relevance of these old ideas for a social movement course is not because these are still prevalent within academia, it's because these views can still inform social views that are prevalent in society. So in other words, when people say to demonstrators, get a life or get a job, then essentially they're kind of a throwback to these kinds of ideas. Okay, now sometimes in the functionalist theory, the number of angry people, as it were, may be larger than normal. Within functionalism, something has disturbed the normal state of affairs. So this is where we get a slight nuance to the theory, because rather than just wholly seeing people as irrational individuals, maybe if there is some social disturbance, then that could actually be a warning signal, and perhaps therefore there is a problem in society, and that could be defined as the issue that society is not delivering its usual rewards. And then there's a social disturbance. If there's a social disturbance, that can raise emotions, and then people may become anxious or annoyed or even jealous, and therefore this situation, this set of circumstances, may swell the numbers of people prepared to step out of line, as it were. In periods of rapid social change, then these problems can cause issues for social stability. Robert Merton, following Durkheim, talks about anomie. Now, the concept of anomie in sociology is defined as normlessness. We could also think in Marxist terms, or using ideas associated with Marx and Weber, and we can think about alienation as well. Such things, anomie or alienation, may increase the risk of a social explosion, and the theory goes, collective behaviour may be the outcome. To summarise all this then, via Stephen Buchler, and his book is called Social Movements in Advanced Capitalism, Buchler says that there is a distinctive theoretical lens for examining collective behaviour, and it's got some core assumptions. First, the idea of a unitary concept of collective behaviour, which will embrace a range of examples such as panics, crazes, crowds and movements. So we can see from that list the kind of general area in which social movements were placed alongside panics, crazes and, if you like, out of control crowds. Collective behaviour is essentially non-institutional. It's seen as the formless activity. It's shapeless. It doesn't have a pattern, and it's unpredictable. Its primary causation is rooted in the individual. Its meaning is psychological rather than political. In other words, it's a reaction on an individual level to societal stress or to social strain or breakdown. The politics of the 1930s seems to make sense in these theoretical terms. Neil Smelser, in a book called The Theory of Collective Behaviour from 1962, cites times such as the Industrial Revolution, with social currents and movements created by that issue. So the Industrial Revolution is said to have created Luddism and Chartism and religious and sectarian groupings. Smelser also reinforces the notion that collective behaviour is irrational and explained from the outside. Smelser suggests that collective behaviour can be inspired by a generalised belief For example, a generalized belief in a Zionist conspiracy towards world domination, or a generalized belief that all men are rapists, or a generalized belief that no Catholic or Protestant can be trusted. When I mentioned this in the lecture on the 15th, someone said, well, that just about covers everyone. However, going back to the relationship between the theorists and their subject, if you like, the activists concerned, their motivations, their stories are not important. They're not part of the theory. Nowadays, if people protest, often you would want to find out why. Find out what their story is, what's going on. In terms of this theory, there was no such inquiry. The motivations of the activists, their particular stories, were not of interest to the theory. Therefore, Buechler, on page 26, summarizes all this in this way. What distinguishes collective behavior from normal responses to change is that it compresses or short-circuits levels of social action, giving collective behavior a crude, excessive, eccentric, impatient quality when compared to routine and institutionalized social action. So we have Smelser then, the functionalist, who went some way towards providing an account of underlying social conditions for the emergence of these irrational, unpredictable forces, which may seem to erupt out of nowhere. Historian E.P. Thompson attacks Smelser's system perspective, and Thompson opts to reconstruct what he sees as the broad social movement which lay behind the creation of what became the working class. So we're seeing now the first, if you like, challenge to this kind of dominant way of looking at mass movements and organization and mobilization. We're seeing a difference in perspective, in this case between a functionalist analysis and Thompson's humanistic Marxism. And we also see here that one of the key issues is the change in the view of the analyst and in terms of what they do. For example, Smelser is taking on the detached so-called scientific observer role, whereas Thompson is involved in the movements that he is seeking to describe. The collective behavior approach is now becoming criticized because it tends to underestimate the rationality in social movements. It fails to do justice to how movements develop. It fails to look at the organizational shape or the direction of social movements. That said, there are still commentaries right into the 1990s which suggest that social movements can be unpredictable and irrational, unreasonable and disorganized. So you can still see throwbacks to that in theoretical approaches right into the 1990s. There is a significant theoretical transition with the emergence of the Chicago School of Sociology, and some of the people in the Chicago School were interested in collective behavior. The Chicago School is where the issue of symbolic interactionism developed, a discipline in sociology. And so we have Herbert Blumer, who wrote an influential essay on social movements. Blumer's definition of social movements is this: collective enterprise to establish a new order of life, which already might seem to be a bit more optimistic than the views that preceded it. Now, one of the issues about Blumer is that he imposed a kind of career onto a social movement. So let's just have a look at one of the things that he writes, and this is from Blumer, the social movements paper. This is reprinted in Lyman in the 1990s, and the Lyman reference is Social Movements, Critiques, Concepts and Case Studies, published by Macmillan. So Blummer writes this: the career of a social movement depicts the emergence of a new order of life. In its beginning, a social movement is amorphous, poorly organized, and without form. Collective behavior is primitive, and the mechanisms of interaction are elementary and spontaneous. As a social movement develops, it takes on the character of a society. It acquires organization and form, a body of customs and traditions, established leadership, an enduring division of labour, social rules, and social values. In short, a culture, an organization, and a new scheme of life. Now, I've reproduced that on your screen because that's quite a dense passage, not least because it starts to move into things like resource mobilization. Once we get into that in the course, we'll see how these kind of elements were developed. Now, in that career analysis by Blummer there's strong elements and echoes of Max Weber. Blummer has a series of phases. For example, there's an initial unfocused social ferment. There's then a period of popular excitement. But then we get to the issue of formulation, institutionalization, and professionalism. At the same time, Blummer still leaves us with a fairly ill-defined sense of social movements. It's still a little bit, we get a sense of irrationality, and which might be something that erupts out of nowhere. There's no sense yet that there may be kind of social grievances, as it were, lying around waiting to be picked up, which is something that developed later. Once we get fully into the 1960s, more and more we see that social movements participation is being seen differently. Now, rather than being based on irrational individuals, we're seeing social movements as being seen as rational and strategic social actors in their own right. So let me introduce a quote which comes from Jacobs and Landauer from 1966 from a book called The New Radicals, a report with documents by Random House. And they write, "The movement is a melange of people, mostly young people, organizations mostly new, and ideas mostly American. These young people believe that they must make something happen, that they are part of a movement stirring just below the surface of life hitherto accepted. The movement is organizations plus unaffiliated supporters, who outnumber by thousands and perhaps even hundreds of thousands those committed to specific groups. The movement's strength rests with those unaffiliated reserves. To be in the movement is to search for a psychic community in which one's own identity can be defined. Social and personal relationships based on love can be established and can grow, unfettered by the cramping pressures of the careers and lifestyles so characteristic of America today," written in 1966. A number of themes there then, and some of them very 1960s obviously. A movement as community, which is a very modern idea, that people are able to define their identity through involvement with social movements. Again, another idea about the issue that movements are they transform individuals. There are loose frameworks within social movements, and there are no real members. So these are leading pointers to later analysis. Buechler writes this in 2000 on page 32. "The social and political activism of the 1960s made the single biggest contribution to changing the intellectual and socio-historical climate in which sociology and social movement theory existed." Now, I often joke when I'm doing my critical theory course by saying to people, to the students obviously, Do you know, it might be a surprise to you, but students were once radical, and radical students were central to social movements in the 1960s, especially in the United States, at least in the United States first, as it were. There was a lot of mobilization around opposition to the Vietnam War, for example, civil rights, and the advent of second wave feminism. Conflict within society resulted in students becoming critical of the university authorities and even self-critical, so reflexivity was the order of the day. Western Europe followed the United States. There was a large anti-Vietnam War demo in Europe. The French, the British and the German students started to look at the power structures in universities, and this coincided with a big explosion in quote-unquote left-wing ideas. So this is Jacobs and Landauer's, again from 1966, account of Students for Democratic Society, which is usually described as SDS, a key student organization in the United States. This is an insight into the nature of the movement, and we can see now that things are really moving into the kind of hippie area, if you like, but we're kind of starting to see the congealing of movements, even if theoretical things are undeveloped. It says here, theory and even ideology are uncomfortable words. Most SDS members are anti-ideological, not well read in Marxism or in other radical literature, but move to action primarily by events in their own lives. SDS is more than an organization. It is a community of friends. Personal relationships are inseparable from public political life. The vocabulary and community life are part of the SDS style. At group meetings, their openness is apparent. They exhibit great tolerance, and no speaker is silenced, no matter how irrelevant or repetitious. And it is difficult to single out those who hold authority. Leaders mean organization. Organization means hierarchy, and hierarchy is undemocratic. SDSs believe that the new movements are in their infancy, and a great amount of work has to be done at the base. Theory, or long-run strategy, is a fuzzy notion to them. The question of how to link the various projects is unanswered. So here we see people are doing something new, at least to them, and there is a difference here between this and conventional politics, which was later theorized as DIY politics. So this, what they were doing, was not orthodoxy. Now, there is a rift now between this kind of movement, which was growing in the student body, and the so-called organized left, who were said to be very unimpressed. They described this as adventurism and described it as infantile. Okay, so our story so far is that collective behavior theorists had difficulty seeing protest except in terms of that something had gone wrong in society and through the individual pathology of protesters. That the early theorists were not interested in the inner life of social movements. Or for the course we do have a handout here, and so this is how it goes. These are the questions thus far and the limited answer which comes from the early social movement theories. The question being, what are new social movements? The answer being outbreaks of collective behavior. What are the social conditions which gave rise to them? Answer being the situation of social stress. Who becomes involved and how? The answer being random aggregates of psychologically predisposed individuals. How are movements organized? The answer being a question mark. They tend not to be. Question, what is their inner life like? The answer being no comment. the theory is not interested. And finally, what are their effects? And the answer being disruption. But even though seen as disruptive and also based on individual pathology, they may have a positive function in the sense that they may act as a warning sign for anomic or difficult, unstable conditions. Then we've seen a dramatic shift in theoretical terms that occurs in the 1960s and through the student protest. Now theorists often involve themselves in social movement activity, or new people who were involved found some rationality in protest participation. In the trippy 1960s, activists adopted a style of talk which made, quote, a virtue of their inability to articulate and analyze coherently. They talked from the gut, stumbling, using the language of the new folk singer. This is from Jacobs and Landau, with reference to Dylan, of course. But there's a commitment now to participatory democracy that was felt to underpin a passionate anti-authoritarian ethos, a preoccupation with direct action, community and self-activity that carried into virtually every arena of struggle. Remembering the point that even theorists are products of their time, it is important not to overstate what the 1960s represent in terms of social movement theory. Yes, it was a dramatic moment, but the 1960s spirit was short-lived and probably not felt as widely as popular histories suggest. In fact, people do now talk about the burnout after the, quote, events of 1968. We have seen that those who might be characterized as coming from the political right saw social movements as unnecessary and self-indulgent. The situation of the view from the political right is not too dissimilar from those looking at social movements from the political left. The student movement did not exist in isolation, and we can look at this in different ways. Like a theorist called Carl Boggs, we can see the student movement as part of the new left, or we can regard it as a social phenomenon that tapped into a much wider sense of youth culture. So in other words, we could look at it politically or culturally. The first interpretation looked at the demonstration outside the Chicago Democratic Conference as a key occurrence in the United States in the 1960s. The later would look towards events such as Woodstock. But what we've got thus far then is a wide sense that something new was happening. This is reflected in two summaries, one by Scott and one by Buechler. The one by Scott is from a book from 1990 called Ideology and the New Social Movements, from Unwin Hyman. And Scott says this: movements are typified by 1, primarily social rather than political, 2, less concerned with achieving state power than transforming values and lifestyles. That's what sets it apart from the left. 3, hence localized in civil society rather than the state. Again, sets it aside from the left. 4, attempting to bring about change through cultural innovations and identities. 5, using grassroots and network types of organization. Buechler talks about the theoretical paradigm shift leading to social movements being seen as 1, distinct from collective behavior, worthy now of analysis in their own right. 2, showing their own enduring patterned and institutionalized elements, which is similar to Blummer. 3, being rooted in collective understandings and in group interests, which is a new development. 4, having claims to be treated as rational phenomena. 5, constituting, therefore, political rather than psychological entities. So, as we can see there from those summaries and from this account so far, that things really moved on in theoretical terms to start looking at social movements in a different way. We've not yet got to the idea that social movements are bureaucracies, and to businesses that's going to come, but we can see that we're already moving in that way, if you like. Okay, so the student movement turned out to not be a one-off. It was seen actually as a precursor to other developments, and this took some observers by surprise. So we have this account from Della Porta and Diani from 1999, which is on the reading list, and the title of that is Social Movements: An Introduction, 1999. When a new wave of environmental activism emerged in the 1970s, along with other movements on issues such as peace, women's and human rights, it was difficult for political analysts to relate it to previously dominant conflicts. Such difficulties are largely persistent to date. The key issue there is the source of protest and its direction. So the student movement could be regarded as surprising in a number of ways, but revolving around the idea of the revolt of the privileged. Sociologically, it makes more sense for protest to come from the deprived elements of society and the disadvantaged. And it is this assumption in theory that was applied to social movements from the left. Effectively, social movement credentials were being checked by such models to understand social protest. So there's a problem of the new social movements from the position of the left. So theoretically we can be thinking of so-called conflict theories, which are embedded into Marx and Weber, which are based on investigating societal material inequalities and based on the impact of social class. So they have a basic framework of understanding which doesn't fit well to the emergence of new social movements. This framework is as follows. Politics is seen as revolving around a set of clearly defined material interests. These interests are distinct and frequently contradictory between differing social groupings. Each group tends to organize around the pursuit of its material interests in opposition to others. Parties and political organizations represent interests. Political power, control of the state, contested to change the structure of inequality. Economic concerns are central. Other concerns could wait. A fully developed political challenge brings specific material interests together in a general vision of an alternative society. So that led to the general inquiry about, did the student movement really fit in to this left model? They did, and often talked the language of class conflict. They said that they stood for the disadvantaged, but they lacked working class support in their actions. They did not function, however, in a way characteristic of the left. Indeed, the student movement, both in Europe and the United States of America, mostly kept a certain distance from normal politics. They were outside of the political establishment. Their activities were extra-parliamentary. Politics were beginning to be seen as part of the problem. Politics was not seen as part of the solution. Politics became something to bypass, which is another idea embedded into the idea of DIY politics, bypassing conventional politics. So for them then, the students, it's better to be involved in outrageous stunts. So they had things like, let's do a demonstration where we try to levitate the Pentagon, or we stick flowers down the barrels of rifles, or, and the yippies did this, they nominate a pig for president. So what would sociologists make of this? So this comes from Della Porta and Diani, and it's a series of questions really under three headings. What is the social base of this movement? It is not working class in any obvious sense, but what kind of social position do students occupy? And in what ways could this provide a stable and alternative foundation for organised social action, and for what reasons? Secondly, who or what is the enemy? Is there an opponent which somehow represents the antagonist of students as a social force? In their own perceptions, it is not straightforwardly capitalism or the rich being targeted, but a much wider and less well-defined notion of authority or domination, which seems as much a matter of generational as class politics. The student movement shades over into the counterculture, which is against everything that is square and uptight. Lastly then, whose interests are being served? The movement appears to be neither class-based nor organised within the framework of standard national politics. It is not competing for control of the state as an alternative potential ruling group or class, and to some extent it claims to speak for everyone, for universal rights and participation or liberation, in a way which eludes confinement within ordinary political limits. Is it a movement of all parties and none? So these questions are framed within a model that suggests that the notion of class struggle does set the agenda correctly. Without fulfilling these class-based criteria, the theory might be likely to place social movements back into the category of collective behaviour. The theory determines what counts as social movements. Therefore, the movements of the 1960s and 1970s sat very difficultly with or within left-wing expectations and within left models. So what are the fears, or what were the fears, and still are maybe, of the left? First of all, do they see new social movements as a diversion, which is probably true and is probably a serious threat to alliance politics? Why elevate, or even levitate, secondary issues such as the liberation of women when the class war is yet to be won? So we have this observation from Elizabeth Meehan, cited in Scott. For some time, a strong strand of opinion existed on the political left that feminism was a conservative diversion from the pursuit of class equality, and that women's rights would be a natural byproduct of general social transformation. And in fact, that's really the basis of the argument between radical feminists and Marxist feminists. So all this then can be described as diversion, or the fear of diversion, versus the personal is the political, which is the new kind of theme of these movements that emerged in the 1960s into the 70s. Now, some will argue that capitalism has successfully bought off the working class. Now they, the working class, have no revolutionary edge. Instead, the conflict moves to key consumption goods, consumed collectively or privately. Issues like decent roads, housing, urban amenities. So this is where we're going to end for now with Stuart Lowe, with a book from 1986 called Urban Social Movements. And examples of urban social movements are tenants' organisations, ratepayers groups, squatters, campaigns for and against slum clearances, and for and against school and hospital closures, groups wanting road widening, groups who want a bypass, and groups who don't. Some of that could be seen as a subset of the environmental movement. Now, here, and this is where we'll leave it for now, we can see a difference here in the sense that these organisations are now focusing on smaller issues. They're not talking about a class war against the capitalist class. They're not talking about taking over the state. They're talking about making changes within their own areas or within their own lives, which is why they're called urban social movements. Okay.